The Nintendo Switch is the second best-selling home console of all time, and it's not hard to see why. With games like Super Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2, and Breath of the Wild coming out early in the Switch's lifecycle, it set the tone for what this new generation of games would look like, giving confidence to the consumer. Even with its success though, it still falls short of the PS2, which had its own games that established how amazing the console would be, and those games were GTA 3, Tony Hawk 3, and Final Fantasy X, which in my opinion is the greatest game ever made. Now, the greatest game ever made is kind of a big statement. Just considering it the best Final Fantasy game is sure to give me some glares. Even considering it the best PS2 game of all time would draw a debate. But honestly, I don't think there is a debate, because Final Fantasy X is literally the perfect game. You could play this game over and over and over and never get tired of it, in which case you'd be like me, who's achieved literally everything in this game and still wanted to play it again. In case it wasn't blatantly obvious, I'm pretty obsessed with this game. But what makes it so great? Let's get into it. And don't worry, I won't give you any spoilers for the storyline. So you start out as this guy named Tidus, whose home is destroyed by a giant whale monster named Sin. If you couldn't tell already, this game is going to have a lot of religious undertones to it, but it's more complex than the typical "the church is bad" trope you'd get from modern storytelling. You're then transported to this place called Spira, where you find out that the place where Tidus came from was destroyed 1,000 years ago. Obviously, Sin is the reason he's here in the first place, so he wants to write it back 1,000 years so that he can play more Blitzball. The only way he can make that happen is by following this summoner named Yuna, and since she's kinda hot, he also decides to be her guardian. A guardian's job is basically just to protect their summoner, and a summoner's job is to pray at every temple so that they can get these cool monsters named Aeons. Once she prays at every temple, she can get the final Aeon, which she'll then use to defeat Sin. At the beginning, you're basically just wandering around, following whoever will pay attention to you. But eventually, your main goal becomes going to all the temples in Spira, collecting all the Aeons, and trying to stomp that giant whale monster. That's all I can say about the story without spoiling anything, but it's genuinely the best storyline I've ever experienced in a video game. There's so much depth to it, with all kinds of secondary plots thrown in to keep the entire journey fresh and exciting. There's more to it than the idea of good and bad. It's about sticking to personal morals when you're caught in a moral gray area. It's a story that I believe any philosophy major or theology major would find a lot of insight in. And the more I play it, the more I see genuine humans really showing who they are and what they believe in. Another aspect that I'm sure you've noticed by now are the designs. This was one of the last games that Squaresoft created before they merged with Square Enix and went downhill. And to give you a little idea as to how much creativity they had during this time period, their very next game was Kingdom Hearts, which I've already spoken at lengths about. The designs of the characters are outmatched, giving you a huge range of personality types that mesh together in a unique way. You see them fighting with each other, but deep down, you still see how deep their connection with each other is. Spira is arguably the most well-designed world in all of video games, giving you biomes that are futuristic, scenic, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, urban, sacred, and everything in between. No matter what area of the game you're in, you look forward to it. Every single biome in the game matters, and it has a richness that completely entrenches you in the experience. The monsters in this game are probably the coolest monsters you'll find outside of maybe Pokemon. It's like they took the Renaissance painters and gave them the ability to make 3D models. The fiends are intimidating, and the Aeons are the most majestic, daunting, and beautiful creatures I've ever seen in a video game. While the story and the gameplay are great, you would have a genuine excuse to play this game just for the aesthetics of it. Actually, speaking of gameplay, let's talk about this next. Final Fantasy X is not open world, but honestly, I think it's better because of it. Rather than using a joystick to move the camera around, the camera follows you and shows you a view from the sky so that you can see everything around you. Does that mean you can't explore? Absolutely freaking not! There are celestial weapons that you can only obtain by going outside the established path, and you can upgrade them by doing minigames found throughout the game. There are secret Aeons that you can only find by doing quests outside the established storyline. Of course, since this is a JRPG though, a good chunk of the game is the battle system. And this is where Final Fantasy X shines above the rest, including every other game in the franchise. So let me start out by saying that aside from bosses, battles are random encounters when you're walking along a path, and I wouldn't have it any other way. For, at the very least, most of the locations in this game, the encounter rate is perfect, giving you plenty of steps to walk before you're in another battle. This gives you a sense of progress while also giving you plenty of opportunities to gain levels in the meantime. You'll go into battle with 3 team members, and if they're all dead at once, it's game over. This usually gives you plenty of time to revive party members either with Phoenix Downs or magic, but you'll also need to pay attention to when the enemy's turn starts, which makes this the best battle system in all of video games. It's turn-based, which means that rather than mashing the X button, you're actually strategizing based on which party members you have out and whose turn is coming up next. You're constantly thinking about the situation at hand, who has the tools you need to beat your opponent, and when you should swap out certain characters for others. You can add or remove buffs to yourself or the opponent. You can summon Aeons to battle for you. Some enemies have elemental weaknesses. Some enemies are really slippery and require a character specifically with a lot of accuracy. Some enemies can be taken apart. Each battle requires a different way of thinking to beat them, and it's something that you can't just use muscle memory for like in a fighting game or an open world. Then, when you win, rather than gaining levels like in other RPGs, you gain sphere levels. This leads us to the most beautiful skill tree ever made. Rather than automatically gaining 3 strength and 2 defense when you grow a level, you go through a sort of choose your own adventure with something called the Sphere Grid. The Sphere Grid lets you choose which path to take to gain certain attributes, such as strength, speed, or abilities. Granted, for the most part it sets you down a very specific path that you probably want to take anyway just to add a diverse move pool that no one else in your party has, but if you use Key Spheres, you can jump ship and head down an entirely new path. Kimahri is one example of a character that was meant to be a real choose your own adventure, so I turned him into a healer, but on the way, there were a whole bunch of strength spheres, so not only did he have the healing abilities of Yuna, but he also hits as hard as that like button. Now, are there any issues with the game? Now that I've mentioned all these positive qualities that the game has, are there any places where the game dropped the ball? And after thinking about it, the answer really is no. This game is genuinely perfect. I mean, I guess I can throw out a few extremely minor gripes here and there. Sometimes when you're casting a spell on one of your characters, it's difficult to know whether to move horizontally or vertically on the direction pad, so sometimes you have to toggle between your party and the enemy. It takes a couple seconds, but you figure it out eventually. There's also no way to skip the cutscenes, and while for 99% of the game you'd never want to anyway, but at the same time anyone who recognizes this area right here will know exactly what I'm talking about. Granted, I'm seriously trying to think of any other problem I could possibly have with this game, and genuinely, there's nothing wrong with it. There's a reason I keep coming back and playing it year after year after year. I already know everything that's going to happen. I've already beaten the games more times than your father has told you that he loves you. I've literally completed 100% of this game. I found all the Aeons, I found all the legendary weapons along with their respective crests and sigils. I have every overdrive and overdrive mode, including all of Riku's mixes. I completed the Sphere Grid with every character, and I filled literally every empty node with attribute spheres. I caught every single fiend in the monster arena, and I've even defeated Nemesis. You cannot do that with any ordinary game. The amount of content this game has completely outmatches even games you'd find on shelves today. This game completely revolutionized how a game should be played, with voice acting and graphics that far exceeded what we thought was possible for the PS2. It saddens me that with their next 2 entries in the series, Squaresoft fell off a cliff in quality, and they've never been the same since. Final Fantasy X is the last game in the series that is universally adored by fans of the Final Fantasy franchise, and for good reason. If you're a fan of JRPGs and you haven't given Final Fantasy X a try yet, do it. I don't just believe it's the most underrated game of all time, I believe that it's the best game, period. And I don't want you to miss out on the experience that I had. So, what do you think? Have you played Final Fantasy X yet? If not, do you think you might want to give it a try? Leave a comment to let me know, and I'll see you guys next time.